Welcome, everyone. My name's Dan Fagan. I'm a professor of science journalism here at New York University and the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program, the Science Communication Workshops. And today, we're going to scratch a real itch for me, and that is, I really hate it as a journalist when something important is happening in the world and I just really don't understand it. And this is certainly one of those topics. Cryptocurrency and the blockchain technology that makes it possible are popping up in really interesting and important ways and changing the way we live slowly and now maybe not so slowly in ways that are obvious and ways that are not obvious at all. So it seems like an important time for journalists, whether they're basic Bitcoin idiots like I am, or whether they're sophisticates, to spend some time thinking about how to cover this well. So I'm very grateful to Nathaniel and to Neha for joining us. Mike will introduce them formally. But I did want to introduce Mike, who's going to be our moderator tonight. Mike Orcutt is news editor at The Block, which is a publication that, as you might expect, covers blockchain and cryptocurrency. He's a former senior reporter and associate editor at MIT Technology Review. He was there for 9 years. And before that, he was a SHRP student who I was lucky enough to have taught. So when I had the idea to do a session on crypto and blockchain, Mike was the obvious choice. So with that, just quick ground rules. The chat is open, but please don't use the chat for questions. We really strongly encourage you to ask questions, but use the Q&A box, and Mike and I will keep an eye on it. And we have a lot of journalists here, and so we're going to really try to focus on getting in as many questions and answers as possible, but use the Q&A box. So with that, I will turn this over to Mike Arquette for formal introductions, and I will blink out and start pay attention, even though my video will be off. I'll be listening carefully. So Mike, take it away.
Thank you for that, Dan. I'm always very happy to be back in the near SHRP orbit. And I can't really believe that it was 10 years ago that I was there. And one reason for that is that almost every day I use something that I learned while I was at SHRP. And that's I wouldn't make something like that up. I'm not just sucking up to Dan. So my name is Mike Orcutt, and I am the friend who won't shut up about Bitcoin. It's not because I hold Bitcoin or trade Bitcoin or think Bitcoin is necessarily good or bad. It's because I think that it's fascinating. I'm going to ramble a little bit about Bitcoin before I introduce our esteemed panelist, since I am that friend. The reason that I'm fascinated is that here you have this digital form of money that is secured by a network of people who don't have to reveal who they are to each other. This was created 10 years ago by someone or some group of people who continued to remain unknown and went by the name Satoshi Nakamoto. So very mysterious from the beginning. Today, the Bitcoin network is worth more than $1 trillion. In my day-to-day work at The Block, seems like every week or so, last several months, another established traditional financial institution or publicly listed company has revealed that they're rolling out services to let their customers buy or sell crypto, or even just investing directly into Bitcoin themselves. So the question that we're addressing in this talk is, how do we make sense of all this? It's a big part of the journalist's job, right? It's to make sense of new things. And Bitcoin and digital currency speaking broadly, is an extremely complicated new thing. And now that it maybe is finally breaking into the mainstream, it's more urgent than ever that we make sense of it. And to say that this topic is tricky, though, is an understatement. I've jumped around from, as a reporter, from a lot of different topics to topics, particularly science and technology topics. And I think that this one is particularly uniquely tricky. It's not just tricky for journalists, it's tricky for anyone who I think wants to make sense of it. Maybe not so much for Neha, which we were talking about before we got on before we started talking, but we can get into that a little bit more. I think that it's just difficult to talk about it in a way that helps people understand what it means, and maybe more importantly, what it could mean. And one reason for that is that it's so new still. Satoshi Nakamoto first described the concept 11 years ago, but some of the basic language, even the term blockchain itself, is still being developed and settled. Terms like cryptocurrency and decentralized can mean different things to different people. Another reason that it's tricky is that it is actually several profound things all at once. It's a new kind of computer network that uses cutting edge cryptography to let thousands of people around the world who don't know each other set their computers up to automatically maintain and secure a shared accounting ledger. But it's also money, or at least some kind of new financial asset. And from a journalistic point of view, it's also tricky because it's so interdisciplinary. Understanding it requires dabbling in computer science, game theory, economics, cryptography, and even politics, and not understanding the role that one of those things is playing can lead the reporter, I think, to miss the story. So the bottom line is that this makes sense to people in different ways, and different people make sense of it in different ways. And that was in the forefront of my mind when I sat down to put this panel together. So that's my rambling, and that's the segue to my intro of our panelists. I'm going to start with Neha Narula. Neha is the director of the Digital Currency Initiative at the MIT Media Lab. She's a computer scientist with the background in distributed systems, and that's something I'd like her to explain for us here at the beginning. But I'm going to ask each of the panelists a similar question, just to kind of introduce themselves, which is basically, how did you meet Bitcoin? How did you encounter it? What was it about your background that brought it onto your radar? And then why did you stick with it after you encountered it? So Neha, what do you think about that?
Oh, okay, thanks. And thank you to Dan and Mike for having me here. It's really nice. I don't get to speak to journalists often, so this is really interesting. Yeah, so I guess I first encountered Bitcoin, or first heard of it, at least, I think around 2011, and didn't really do very much with it and didn't really think very much of it. And unfortunately, it wasn't until a few years later that I really came back to it. I think I had an impression of it that unfortunately a lot of academics have, which is, okay, when you're steeped in sort of trying to think of novel research, you see Bitcoin, you're like, okay, this is pasting a few existing ideas together. And oh, by the way, also, that doesn't seem like that's going to work long term. So let's just dismiss this. That's sort of a generic way of looking at it. And then in 2015, I think that's when I actually spent some time trying to understand how it really worked. And I learned that it was much more complex than the sort of abstract notion I had of it, which is like, oh, okay, there's a bunch of computers and mining and they make a blockchain that lists transactions. And, that was really due to a few people at MIT who took the time to talk to me about it. And that's when I realized, oh, even in my field, this is something new. This is actually quite different than what has come before. And it wasn't just pasting a bunch of known things together. I think once you take another look. And oh, also, by the way, this is how money, in the course of learning how it worked as a system, I started learning about what money is. And that was just a whole rabbit hole of, oh my gosh, like, holy, just like, do people know this? Do people know that there's really nothing all behind it? And so that was kind of exciting, learning about fractional reserve banking system, and the history of coins, and the history of debt, and learning a bit about financial instruments in the world today. And those two things together were sort of just the most fascinating thing I could think of to work on. And also, it just seemed like such a massive opportunity. Up until that point, I think I'd felt that when it comes to the ability to change things in the world, based on what I had seen, technology was sort of the best lever. It was the most scalable. You could have someone writing a computer program that millions of people could use, or billions of people could use. So that software could be usable in ways that, very small number of people could make a very big change. And then I realized, oh, actually, economics incentives are also one of these things that are sort of this lever that can influence people even more scalably than technology. And marrying those two things together, that's just really powerful. So that's just a little bit about how I got into it and what was interesting about it to me.
Can you talk a little bit about the aspect that you mentioned about pasting some existing things together to create something new, and because what was it that was actually new that you saw that had been pasted together, and why hadn't those things been pasted together before, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so there's this really amazing paper by Arvind Narayanan and a few other co-authors called Bitcoin's Academic Pedigree. And I think it does a fantastic job of putting those ideas into context with the literature in computer science, at least. So I'll try to sort of name a few of those areas now, but I don't think I'm going to be totally thorough. So one of them is this idea of peer-to-peer networks. So instead of having a central sort of server that talks to everybody, it's the idea that we can kind of all talk to each other and exchange information in a peer-to-peer fashion. If we just talk to enough people, eventually information will gossip around through the network. And peer-to-peer networks are something that have been around for a long time. They've been used in sensor networks. BitTorrent is a peer-to-peer network. There are other things like that. And it sort of had its heyday in computer science research, I guess maybe early 2000s, and then sort of kind of got a little less popular once people sort of figured out what they wanted to figure out about it. So that was one area. And another was this idea, of eCash, of using cryptography and trying to make digital tokens and digital cash. Basically, that had been a whole area. And then there was this proof of work idea, which is using compute cycles for things. And there was this idea of reaching consensus in a network. And I think that's what really struck. I mean, putting all these ideas, there were more ideas, but putting all those things together, I'd spent some time just studying distributed systems, and there was a very rich literature in distributed systems that went back to the 80s, the 1980s. And but they always made certain assumptions about the types of systems we were building. It was always sort of from the perspective of, you're running a program and you want to be able to tolerate a machine failing, or two machines failing, or three machines failing. And maybe you want to tolerate the ideas that you're running a program. If you unplug your computer, program stops running, right? But maybe you're running something really important and you don't want that to happen. So maybe you can run it on 2 or 3 machines. And what are the protocols to make sure that even if one computer gets unplugged, it'll keep working? And then they also got to the point where they said, hey, maybe one of the computers has been attacked by a hacker. They're actively doing stuff, not just the computer's unplugged. How do I keep the program working? And so the first version of that, the unplugging thing, that's been very widely adopted. Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, Facebook, they all have that type of system inside their data centers. They're all using that technology. The version of it, which is, I don't just want to tolerate computers coming unplugged, but I want to tolerate a hacker or bugs or something really crazy happening, that never really got adoption in the real world. The only example of it that I've been able to find is actually NASA. So the idea was that when you're sending like a rover or rocket or whatever to space, you're not going to be able to go reboot the computer when it's thousands of miles away from Earth. And so and they wanted to be able to tolerate more types of errors. So they actually invested in this research. But that's the only time I've ever heard of anybody using it until Bitcoin. And then that's when, and it was on a totally different scale. It wasn't just 3 computers, 4 computers, 5 computers. It was thousands of computers around the world agreeing on something in a very adversarial context where anybody could join the network, anybody could start participating. And so that was very exciting to me. That was very new in my opinion. Yeah.
Neha is responsible for several of my aha moments where I think I asked the same question, I think 3 or 4 different times, and then finally you explained it in a way that I got it. And I think that what it helps is understanding that these things, like you said, are pieces of that Bitcoin and blockchain networks are made up of components that existed before. But that was me approaching this topic as a technology reporter. And so that's a good segue for me to intro our other panelist, Nathaniel Popper, who is a financial reporter. Nathaniel has been a reporter at the New York Times since 2012. And before that, he was at the LA Times. He's also written a book entitled Digital Gold, Bitcoin and the Inside Story of the Misfits and Millionaires Trying to Reinvent Money. Nathaniel, you ended up writing one of the definitive books about Bitcoin. Before Bitcoin came around, you were writing about other financial topics. I'm interested in sort of how you first came across Bitcoin as a reporter, what your editor said when you pitched the story about magic internet money, and sort of how it occurred to you then versus how it occurs to you now as a reporter.
Yeah, well, I think the simple answer to how I came across it is the Winklevoss twins, probably like a lot of people. Actually, it was April 2013 when Bitcoin was undergoing its sort of first really public surge. It, I think, crossed $200 at the time, if I'm not mistaken, and then crashed down. And basically, I remember talking with editors, and there was this whole sort of conversation in the newsroom, like, do we have to cover this? Do we have to write about this? Like, why? Like, can this go away so we can ignore it? Or like, do we have something that we could say to make it feel original, other than all the just people like chiming in and sort of giving an explanation of Bitcoin and why its price, why its price was going up. And a colleague actually got a call from one of the twins. I sadly, but expectedly don't remember which one. And, saying, look, like, we've got, I forget what it was, $12 million of Bitcoin. Up to that point, nobody had come out. Nobody who anybody knew had come out and said, I own Bitcoin. It was just like this criminal thing that nobody wanted to associate with. And they were like, we want to, come out with our story of why we've been doing this, why we've been buying it. And so I wrote this story, and it just like took off. I mean, like, everybody read that story. Everybody remembered the Winklevoss twins. They've obviously since become the sort of, one of the faces. I think since then, there are a lot more famous people who've come out. Yeah, I mean, I thought it was very silly after I wrote that, and I kind of assumed it was going to die. But then, and actually soon thereafter, the price crashed. But, over that next year, it kept coming up, and like, I was the person who'd written about Bitcoin, so I was the one to write the next story too. And I, at some point in like that winter, I went and I wrote a story about this Bitcoin mining farm, which people had now, there have been many of these stories, but it was in Iceland. And I kind of, went and met these guys who had set up this thing near the airport in Iceland because there was cheap energy. And in the months after that, I kept meeting people who had sort of thrown away their old lives to pursue Bitcoin. And it was in that I was drawn to Bitcoin. It was not the notion that it would change the world. It was the notion that like, there's something here that really like sticks with people. And I wanted to understand that. and I remember, I mean, I sort of pitched a book, and within a week it was sold, and I took a year off to do it. And you know, I think from a journalist perspective, I'll just say that, like, the thing that I always tried to do, and the thing that you know, has informed my reporting going forward, is that, you know, this is this very complicated topic on which there are like a million stories. This even goes back to that first article, and the first editor is asking, like, are we just going to write like another weird explanation of like how this thing works? And, you know, from that first story, it's like, no, let's tell the story of a human and why this interests them. And, you know, as I got into it, the more people I talked to, the more like different reasons I heard for why people were so drawn to this. And, you know, that's been this, I think, ongoing story that I've been interested in, is like how Bitcoin means different things to different people. But, you know, I think, like Neha, I've been really interested by, you know, learning about how money works and how technology, like it's given rise to all these broader things. I actually now cover technology. I live out in Oakland. I mean, that's all because of Bitcoin. I've sort of shifted away from finance, and I'm covering, and I'm actually now on my another book leave, writing about like the GameStop phenomenon. But that very much gave rise, you know, the first thing that I did everything with Bitcoin gave rise to this. And to me, I've sort of approached it as, or tried to approach it as, like a human story. And a story of people, because in some ways it's like a social network, and why people have been drawn to this social network.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think one of the things that comes up is that as a reporter, if you talk to enough people about this, then you start to hear different sort of narratives, is the term that I'll use. And then there's some overarching narratives that have been around since the beginning, since Satoshi showed up, and some of them have political implications. Some of them are more about technology and more specific to the financial system or financial privacy. But I'm wondering, Nathaniel, your perspective on how those narratives have sort of stayed the same or changed over the past 10 years or so, starting with, like, I guess the biggest narrative that to me, which is that there needs to be this form of money that's not controlled by the state. And I wonder how you think that's worked out so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think form of money not controlled by the state is still a very dominant narrative, and I think it influences why most people get into this. You know, and there's a lot of things that leads to that it's not controlled by the state. I mean, initially, you know, the first use case I think that people found was buying drugs and doing things illegally, and I think there's a desire often in the Bitcoin community to downplay that. But I think it's actually one of the first things that proved that Bitcoin worked, because it's like somebody who actually needed it to work to do something that they couldn't do otherwise. And I think that's another question I've always asked, is like, why is this useful for something that you couldn't do otherwise? And a lot of the arguments that people make for it are actually things that you can already do, you know, sending money, sending remittances very quickly across borders. Like, you can do that pretty well already. It's not that much cheaper with Bitcoin. I mean, it is in some countries, but not in the United States. So yeah, I mean, that's one narrative. I mean, I think the kind of most interesting narrative clash, or most practical one, is that for a long time, everybody talked about it as money and currency. And it's like, and the whole debate was, well, who accepts it? And it's not very useful as money to buy things, you know, to buy coffee. And like, you know, that was this ongoing thing that was sort of a problem with Bitcoin, and that, you know, has slowed down, I think, adoption, or was used as a pretty legitimate knock against it. And over time, and that it grew out of the fact that, you know, the white paper talks about Bitcoin as digital cash. It imagined it as something that you would use to pay for things online. And you go back to the white paper and it talks about, you know, the credit card fees. And it turns out it wasn't very good for that, or at least it's not very good for that so far. And what it was good for is this idea that I happened to get right in the title of my book, but it almost didn't mean to, is digital gold. I mean, it's a commodity, it's a scarce commodity that, again, no government controls. And so if you're in a place where you're afraid of your government, having a commodity, having an investment you can hold on to is valuable. And sometimes you'll use it as money if you need to buy something quickly, but it's not really that practical for that. So I think that's sort of the most interesting evolution of the narratives. But beneath that, there's a whole lot of other ones. The libertarian narrative, the narrative about illegal activity, the narrative about centralization and decentralization and like anarchy, and those have all kind of evolved over time.
I want to go to Neha on this topic of narratives, and just I wanted to see your thoughts on whether the narratives around Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies have held firm, or if you have a different perspective on it, given what you're working on in your day-to-day. I think one thing that I like to think about and highlight is that these narratives sometimes that people come forward with about cryptocurrencies and about Bitcoin, they exist on different time scales. And that's something that I think about, that I brought over from my technology reporting, general reporting days, was, well, some of these things aren't going to come true like tomorrow, but over the course of decades, maybe they are going to come true. And I know that there's a fair amount of work on the technology side to make, for instance, peer-to-peer payments in Bitcoin more efficient, and there are various approaches to that. But then there are other networks that have sprung up that sort of claim to be better at being money, and it can be kind of hard to make sense of those claims in the larger context. And I'm wondering if you can help us make sense of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think what you just said is really important. It's very hard to make sense of claims. And that's the situation that we sort of found ourselves in, that I think is a little bit unique to the cryptocurrency space, not entirely, but in part because of its connection to incentives and making money, and the fact that a narrative is oftentimes what drives price and gets people very rich or not. So, so you have this sort of weird cycle going on where people want the price of their token to go up. In order for it to go up, you have to get people to buy it. To get people to buy it, you need to convince them that it's exciting and interesting, and one day it's going to be, worth a tremendous amount of money, and get them to take a risk on it. How do you convince them of that? Well, you come up with, also you have to differentiate from all the other tokens out there, right? And so how do you do that? You come up with a story about, the technology and the design and the people and the positioning and all these things, and you have to sell the story. I think that's what happens, is people have this incentive to sell a story in order to sort of get wealthier. And sometimes I think this can be even quite insidious, in that they may not even realize that they're doing this, but perhaps they're getting pressure from their community. Like, why haven't you done these things to make the price of the token go up? Like I've talked to a lot of sort of people who run communities, cryptocurrency communities, who've sort of felt that pressure. I think that's really interesting. I'm not sure if it exactly happens in any other area. So sorry, I don't know if that exactly addresses your question, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it does. I think that it addresses part of it. Another part of my question has to do with where people see Bitcoin going, or whether or not people see Bitcoin at its end point. So the idea that Bitcoin has achieved something by becoming a digital alternative to gold, and that's all that perhaps it needed to achieve. I don't know what I mean by it needed to achieve. And people argue even about what like Satoshi Nakamoto's vision for this even was. It gets kind of a little bit weird sometimes to hear people arguing about what this unknown person wanted to have happen. And so that I'm interested in your thoughts on that too, like the degree to which Bitcoin is a static thing, or something that is in the beginning of its life, or is at least like sort of a living, evolving thing? And is there an endpoint where it is more user friendly to transact like a form of digital cash, for instance?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I don't think Bitcoin's at the end of its life. I do think it's a living, evolving thing. The question as to will it ever get better in way X, Y, or Z is really dependent on how resources are invested in order to make it better in that way. And that kind of comes back to, what are the incentives around these things? You know, who, like, why would, presumably, you know, in order to invest money in hiring user researchers and user experience people and software developers to build applications on top of Bitcoin and make it easier to use, there needs to be an incentive for that to happen. And I think, yeah, the digital gold narrative has sort of that. The digital gold narrative doesn't really need that, right? It just needs custodians and security and decentralization. Those are sort of the things that it needs from Bitcoin in order for that narrative to work. And those aren't the things that are needed for the scalable, you know, cheap digital cash payment narrative. And the digital gold narrative has found a lot of sort of backers, I guess. There's been, you know, a lot of people have sort of bought into that. And I think there are certain limitations to the technology as it exists right now, which make it not very well suited for scalable, easy payments. And there are technologies that have been proposed that can be built on top of it that might make it better for scalable, easy payments. But those technologies are still being kind of proved out, you know, and it's a matter of what people will build and develop. And that comes back to sort of what are the incentives around the system as a whole. And I do think the incentives around Bitcoin are really weird because it didn't have, you know, there's no foundation, there's no company, there's no one responsible for it. The developers who are working on it, a lot of them are just doing it because they love it. You know, maybe some of them are incredibly wealthy Bitcoin holders, but I think quite a few of them probably aren't. And so it's very strange, the incentives around the development and to build things on top of it.
Exactly. That's exactly something that I've experienced as a reporter, as a challenge. And I want to stick with this just for a little bit longer because yeah, so it's the incentives are very weird. It's very difficult sometimes to know who is invested in what, and you can ask them, but it's not just whether or not they're invested in coins. Literally, they could be invested in a narrative or an idea. That's something that's similar to writing about emerging technologies, which is the term we used at Tech Review, that were getting backed by venture capitalists, and we're mostly about a story about the future. And there are examples of like that in crypto, where big name VCs are throwing big dollar figures at these projects. But then, and some of those projects are sort of indistinguishable from what I've come to understand as just technology startups, is particularly in their marketing and their PR departments, where they have very sophisticated communications operations, where they are sending all kinds of pitches to journalists and making all kinds of claims and trying to connect them with so-called experts and all that. But the other thing that happens is the opposite of that, which is something that you just mentioned, which is that a lot of these developers are working on their own time in a volunteer capacity. They're not part of a company. They don't have a communications operation. And so they can be difficult to access. And sometimes those are the people that actually can answer the questions that the reporter has, that I've had in my experience. And they can be difficult to access. Sometimes they are just private individuals that don't, or that maybe they have some preconceived notions about reporters, or they're just difficult to access in general, because people's inboxes are constantly flooded or whatnot, and no one is reminding them, hey, maybe you should talk to this reporter for the sake of the project or something like that. And another thing that I've struggled with in my reporting is finding big picture academic experts who are not sort of invested in a coin or a narrative. And there aren't very many academic groups. out there that are looking at some of these things seriously. And so I just wanted to sort of wrap this up by asking you about the Digital Currency Initiative and what some of the goals are there with that program, because it seems like to me, it's trying to establish cryptocurrency technology, crypto economics, maybe as a legitimate academic field with an academic journal and those things. But can you talk about the goals there and some of the challenges that you've run into trying to do that type of thing?
Yeah, and I'll say I think I've noticed kind of, I'm going to call it an East Coast, West Coast mentality, but it's not limited to the coast, I think. But you know, if on the East Coast, there's definitely a sense of sort of, I don't know, righteousness or idealism of, you know, trying to do things for the public good, maybe in some places. And on the West Coast, there's sort of a desire to maybe build and use capitalism to create things for the public good. And so, you know, maybe the DCI fits a little bit into the East Coast category of those things, is that we definitely, you know, have made the choice to try to stay relatively neutral and to not create our own tokens or systems or things like that. In part, I think, because none of us are really super inclined to do that. We don't really see the reasoning for that. But also, you know, it gives us this added benefit that we're able to speak about the technology, and we're not selling a platform. We're not, you know, it's pretty clear that we don't have an investment or a token or something like that that we are trying to promote. The technology we do choose to work on, if we work on any of these systems, is just our own choice. And so that's been an interesting way to approach this, and especially in a, you know, over the past 5 years, as there's been so much wealth generated and created in this area. But I think it's led to some of the work that we've been able to do. We're able to look at things critically and not sort of worry about pushing forward a specific narrative. Pushing forward a narrative, you know, isn't what we're trying to do. We're focused on technology. And more recently, the two areas we focus on are sort of in the area of cryptocurrency. We're focusing on Bitcoin's long-term security. So thinking about the underlying security of these decentralized networks. A lot of people like to say that Bitcoin can withstand nation state attacks, and it's never been attacked, and you know, it's super strong. And I think if you start to look under the hood, you see a lot of band-aids, and there's also not necessarily a lot of clarity on whether things are going to work long term as certain aspects of the system evolve and change. And so that's something that we've decided we want to invest our time in. The other area where we spend a lot of time is central bank digital currency. So we're working, we have a research collaboration with the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and we're working with them to kind of think about what that could look like and to design it. And some people hear that, oh, you're working with a central bank and you work on Bitcoin. How do these things go together? These seem at odds. But I think it speaks to what we do. We're interested in building protocols for value. We're interested in building open, accessible systems that help preserve privacy. And I think who better to try to design digital cash, even if it's fiat cash, than people who have experience in the cryptocurrency space and have experience, building, running, and maintaining those systems. So that's a little bit about what we've been up to and sort of how we approach things.
Shift gears and go back to Nathaniel, and I want to talk about sort of 2021, what's going on today. You've been paying attention to crypto for a really long time, as we've discussed, and developed a sort of lens with which you can look at what's happening right now from your perspective as a reporter, and now that you're writing a book. But how do you see Bitcoin in the context of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general, in the context of world events in 2021? And is that something that you could have anticipated at all when you first started out?
No, all I had to say simply to that question, no. I mean, I actually want to go back to what you guys were talking about previously.
Sure.
Because I think actually for journalists, that's the most important thing to this is sort of a crowd for journalism and covering this stuff. I mean, I think a lot of the most important stuff to say is around these incentives and around the lack of understanding and the lack of experts in this space. Because I mean, you know, present company notwithstanding, like the journalism about this is just terrible. Like it is historically led to people, you know, getting involved in pump and dumps. It's like, you know, it's like a whole journalism industry dedicated to like the penny stocks, where like all of the sources are the promoters of penny stocks, and nobody understands anything well enough to figure out what's a penny stock and what's not a penny stock. And like, I'm not saying there that Bitcoin is a penny stock, but like, it's just like, there's been such a reliance on promoters and a lack of ability to see people's incentives. And you know, part of this technology is that anybody can make a coin. And that has created enormous problems, which is that all these people who used to be sources, who used to be really knowledgeable, now have their own coins that they're flogging. So like, you know, like half the professors at MIT and Stanford who you would normally want to go to for this kind of thing. Actually, I won't say that, I'm not sure about MIT or where they are, but like you dig beneath the surface and they've got like, oh yeah, of course I have $20 million of holding in some coin that like has never been used for anything. I think it's going to be really great. This is this issue. And I remember, I mean, you know, I once talked with the CEO of CoinDesk in the middle of, I think it was the 2018-17 ICO boom. And it was just like, they were just writing about every ICO, like, oh, they're going to make it easy to pay like for dentists, or they're going to make it easy, you know, they're bringing out the first credit card. And nobody ever actually called Visa and was like, so is this company actually been authorized to bring out a credit card? Like every time I like scratched the slightest bit beneath the surface, you'd find out that the claims were total bullshit. And I just think like it's so important to have good journalism in this space, and people who aren't invested in it succeeding. And I mean, that's one of the hardest things, like, is that everybody is invested in this space who's involved in it. And it's very hard to find people who aren't. And very hard to find people. You tend to have two groups. You tend to have people who think it's stupid and have no, like, don't really understand the technology, and then people who understand the technology but are of course invested in some business model succeeding. And I mean, a lot of that is these coins beyond Bitcoin. I mean, we're talking here about Bitcoin, but a lot of it goes to these thousands of coins beyond that, and the ICOs, and now obviously you have a whole new class of these. And I'm just amazed at every time, like, I'm talking to an expert in this space, and then I remember to ask, like, oh yeah, so do you have a stake in one of these projects? And it's like, oh yeah, I'm an advisor and I get, you know, 20% of my, you know, and it's like, oh, okay, right. So I actually need to discount what you just said by like 60%. So there's a real need for this. And I mean, I think the block is doing certainly a better job than, you know, anybody has before as a crypto publication, and like questioning the claims. And as a journalist, this does come down to just like testing every single claim. Like, okay, you're saying this is going to do that. Has it ever done that? Like, I mean, one of my things around Bitcoin, and I don't know if either of you have different views on this, but you know, one of the big claims around Bitcoin is that it's helping people in the developing world who don't have access to the financial system. And, you know, like when there's hyperinflation, you know, Venezuela, you see a few stories emerging of people using it there, but it's actually very hard to get numbers on how many people are using it. And when you talk to Venezuelans, you know, more than just like the 5 Bitcoin brokers in Venezuela, when you talk to them, is there something that Bitcoin does that they can't do by buying dollars on the street corner there, which is the way most people preserve their money in Venezuela? And there's very little, there's very little good data on this. And there's very little good data for Venezuela, say, like how many of those Venezuelans who are allegedly using it to escape the government are just rich people who have American bank accounts and they're investing in Bitcoin because it's going up in value? And how many of them are actually people who don't have another way to save money? And I mean, that's just the kind of question that a reporter needs to ask. Like, okay, what are the numbers here? What do we know? What do we know beyond, like, yes, this claim logically makes sense, but I think in this whole realm, there's been too much reporting on sort of claims that logically make sense and not enough testing of those claims. Like, is it actually being used for that? You know, and there was a lot of that when everybody was making the argument that, you know, Dell was starting to accept Bitcoin and Expedia was starting to accept Bitcoin. And when you looked at the numbers, they had no sales in Bitcoin. You just needed to like ask that question, follow up on it. And so it really does require, it's an area that needs, you know, better reporters. And I mean, the nice thing is that you can actually make more money reporting about this space than almost anywhere else. There's such a lack of reporting and such a huge amount of money that's flowed into it that, like, you hear about the starting salaries in blockchain crypto reporting and they're higher than they are anywhere else, and you can easily get jobs. So that's a good thing, but like, crypto needs better journalists who are willing to just ask the question, like, what is your conflict of interest? Okay, you're telling me it's going to do that. How would we verify whether it is doing that or not? And let's try to look into that. Like, just ask those basic questions. And I mean, during that ICO boom, there were just so many scams, and like, there were maybe 3 of them that were written about by journalists as scams, 3 of them that were exposed by journalists as scams. And it was just like, anywhere you looked, there was a scam. And for some reason, CoinDesk, and I mean, I'm, you know, picking on them, but like, there was no articles in CoinDesk about any of these companies being scams. Nobody at CoinDesk called up and said like, okay, this company says it has a banking relationship. Do they actually? Like, just, you know, test the claims. And that's, I think, something that, you know, this space really needs a lot of. So it's, I mean, you know, when we're having a journalist audience, I think this is a good thing to talk about.
Yeah, and something I struggle with also, because we are sort of the crypto sphere to some degree, and so we're kind of we kind of inevitably get attached to it, and as long as people are interested in it, then that's good for us. And so, but there are some things that I struggle with.
Interested in it are crypto people who want to make money off of it.
Yeah.
And they hate you if you say something critical. And it's like, I mean, it's a hard line. Even if you don't have, you know, even if your incentives are clear, it's just hard to come to work every day and have everybody be like, why are you shitting on Bitcoin? You know, you like, this is the greatest thing on, you know, since sliced bread. And it's just like, but that is what is needed, I think, in this space, is more people who are like willing to make enemies, willing to call people out.
Neha, I'm wondering if you have any specific reactions to some of the challenges that I think Nathaniel and I both talked about, but then if you have any sort of general commentary on what journalists have done well or what journalists have sort of dropped the ball on when it comes to this topic so far, and what you think is still needed in that area.
Yeah, well, as a reader of journalism, I've certainly been extremely frustrated with a lot of the articles that are basically just quoting, you know, press releases, essentially. No checks whatsoever on whether or not what the press release says actually makes sense or could be viable. So yeah, I think, you know, the past few years have been, or at least 2017, 2018, were incredibly frustrating in that respect. You know, there was a sense of sort of, you know, am I the one who's crazy, or is everyone crazy around me? Because you're reading all these things about how these various coins and networks that have nothing, literally nothing, are gonna, you know, change the world, or even are pretty clearly violating, you know, securities regulation. Are suddenly, you know, everyone was sort of operating in this shared delusion that suddenly certain rules and laws didn't matter anymore. And so that was a little bit frustrating and crazy, and I didn't quite understand why these things weren't being called out in that way. Though, to be fair, I think the regulators were also quite confused. And you know, as you all were speaking, I was thinking about this idea of obfuscation. Something I've noticed, this happens in all technical areas, but usually it gets weeded out pretty quickly. But I think in the cryptocurrency world, it didn't get weeded out. Is sometimes there's some people who sort of capitalize on, speaking about technology in a very complicated way. And so they will talk at you about the technology, and to someone who's not really steeped in it, they sound very smart and very intelligent. And you want to take what you see them as an expert. You want to take what they say at face value, and it can be very, very hard to debunk the things that type of person might be saying, unless you have someone else who knows it extremely well. And so I've seen people sort of fall prey to this, complex technical jargon thing. And I've even seen actual technologists sort of value things that sound complicated, right? Like, oh, this talk is so complicated, it's great. And something, you quickly learn in graduate school, at least, is the importance of communication. And that also, I think something that's drilled into us is, if people don't understand what you're talking about, that's your fault. You need to be so knowledgeable about what you're speaking about that you can explain the really key important ideas at any level. You could have a conversation with an expert and get into the details, but you could have a conversation with a smart teenager and convey to them, the real important essence of the ideas and the trade-offs. And that's what it means to really be an expert, is that you can explain something in a way that people who are not experts can grasp and understand and appreciate. And I think, we need way more of that in the cryptocurrency space.
A question that has come up in the Q&A channel a couple times, which I think is appropriate at this point in the discussion, has to do with this argument over the energy use that's associated with the Bitcoin network. So I'm going to take a step back and explain quickly that the way that individual participants in this network sort of prove that they are trustworthy to the other participants is by expending lots and lots of computing power for the sake of performing a complicated computation that is used to, in a complicated way with cryptography to, like Neha could describe this a lot better than I could, but I always sort of get off track at this point. But basically the way that people prove to the rest of the network that they're trustworthy is by expending lots of their own resources. So the idea is, if you were going to try to manipulate the network, it would be very, very expensive, if not impossibly expensive. So the repercussion of that is that there's a lot of energy that gets used, and this argument is one of those that gets, I'm sure Nathaniel has gotten yelled at about in the same way that he was talking about. People get upset when you point out that Bitcoin uses a lot of energy, and that this argument gets very contentious very quickly. And people talk about how a lot of the mining is in China and uses excess hydropower. It's also very difficult to measure any of these things. But I find, as I've reported on this a couple times, and my conclusion has always been that the data that we have is just not good enough to really understand this at a level of being able to say, for instance, that the Bitcoin network uses the same amount of energy as a sovereign nation, which is often the way that it's put. And maybe that is a fair comparison, but what about the comparison to just the financial system that we use in general, and all of the energy use and greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with that? I would like to give each one of you an opportunity to weigh in on this particular debate, which I think is a really important one, obviously, and one that is particularly has been particularly impenetrable, and for the reasons that we've been talking about so far. And I know that also, I know that Neha is working on, or she's familiar with, technologies that could potentially even reduce that carbon footprint. So I just want to start with Neha, but then I want to have you both take a stab at this.
Yeah, this has been a super frustrating part of the narrative and discussion. I think there's a lot of nuance here, and there are a lot of people, again, who have a vested interest in saying one thing or the other, and I count people who like to sort of post sensational headlines as one of those that category of people as well. I mean, the answer is yes. Bitcoin mining uses a tremendous amount of energy, and like mind-boggling amount of energy, and computational power. And also, I don't know why it's a bad thing that it does necessarily. It's certainly not the most energy usage that out of many different industries. I think aluminum smelting. I don't know the actual data on this, by the way. I'm just sort of talking, so it might be possible that you or Nathaniel actually know this. But there are other industries in the world that use more energy than Bitcoin. And we've decided that those things are valuable. Whether, why is aluminum valuable to us? Why are cars valuable to us? Why are washing machines valuable to us? It takes energy to do all of these things, to make all of these things. And, I guess we've decided as a society that these magical bits on the internet are valuable enough to us to expend this amount of energy on it. So this conversation sometimes just doesn't quite make sense to me. It doesn't. I don't quite understand why we pick this one thing out. Maybe it's because it's so intangible and so strange and doesn't mean anything, doesn't mean a lot to so many people that we call out the energy usage there. Not to say that I like the fact that it uses so much energy. I guess we feel like it's being put towards a use that we don't value, that we're not, we think it's a waste of energy. But other people don't think it's a waste of energy because they're buying it, and they wouldn't buy it if they didn't value it. And if they didn't value it, miners wouldn't mine it. So really, it's the people who are buying it you should be angry with. Tell them to stop valuing it at something. That's the way to get the energy usage to go down.
Right.
It was also super frustrating that people just assumed cryptocurrencies or blockchains in general require tremendous amounts of energy, which is absolutely not true. That was always very frustrating. There are sort of other ways to build them that might not require so much energy. So, dealing with sort of the misunderstanding there has always been very frustrating. But I'm very curious to hear what Nathaniel thinks about this, because I'm sure he's had to sort of tackle this many times.
Yeah, I'm wondering how you make sense of that debate, Nathaniel.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'm thinking through some of what Neha just said. I mean, I do think my general instinct is that in the Bitcoin community, there is a desire to downplay the amount of electricity that this takes. And so generally, this argument goes that a few people who are critical of Bitcoin raise this issue, and then Bitcoiners kind of say all these things that often feel obfuscating to me, like, oh, but because it's drawn to like cheap energy, it's drawn to the cheapest sources of energy, which are going to be green energy. I mean, just like that statement alone, like just because something's drawn to cheap energy does not mean it's going to be green energy. Like I saw lots of, I mean, I was in China and I would see coal plants where there was literally like a enormous power cord connecting the coal plant to the illegal Bitcoin mining facility that was set up next door. And the cheapest kind of electricity is the free kind that you steal because you have like a deal with like a municipal governor or something like that. I imagine that's probably less the case now, but a lot of times cheap energy is very bad for the environment. And so I agree that, like, obviously to a degree, this doesn't matter. Like if people are buying Bitcoin, this is going to happen. It's with Bitcoin, at least for now. There's no plan to make it more energy efficient. I mean, there are other coins like Ethereum and that are using the system currently that want to move away from it. And then there are other coins that don't use it at all. And I think that's really important because that's why this debate matters. Like, well, if we're talking about the future, maybe we want to create incentives to move to a system that doesn't require this. Like the fact that it is more energy efficient than aluminum smelting is not, I have to say, the best argument for an energy efficient technology. Like, my hope is that we move to an energy kind of a new kind of money that doesn't require us to compare it to aluminum smelting or to gold. Like, the fact that, I mean, that's another argument that often comes up. Like, do you know how much energy it takes to mine all the gold in the world? It's like, yes, but this is supposed to be better than gold. It's not like, oh, we've got the equal amount of energy, so we're good. Like, no, this should be better. And that matters because we are deciding what this looks like. And like, consumers are deciding what this looks like. And so consumers should know, like, yes, when you buy this, that's the amount of energy consumption that's involved. And that's, maybe you want to spend your money on a coin that is trying to change that, or maybe you want to, you know, maybe the government, who knows? I mean, government incentives matter a lot here, by the way. But like, the conversation matters because this is changing constantly, and like, we're deciding where we're going, and we should aim to create a technology that is not a enormous, you know, user of greenhouse or producer of greenhouse gases. And as you said at the beginning, Mike, a lot of this is like, we don't actually know how much is using clean energy, how much is using dirty energy. It's hard to get data on that. I would venture to guess that it's using more dirty energy than Bitcoin people want to think. Maybe it's using more clean energy than the critics want to think, but we don't actually know. So we shouldn't like assume anything on that front. But we should, I think it's a very valid question to ask. And it's one of these questions where, again, there aren't enough journalists that don't have an interest in the argument that are just really willing to ask hard questions. Because it is an area where, when you ask hard questions, Bitcoiners will say these things, you know, better than aluminum smelting, or it's, you know, it's better, think about all the energy that, you know, Visa's data centers use. And it's like, yes, those are all useful things to keep in mind, but that doesn't like negate the fact that this is a question, this is an emerging technology where you want to think it can be better than what came before, rather than just you know, equal to what came before.
Mike, can I jump in and ask a question to follow up on that? So we've been talking a lot about how, you know, and my eyes have been opened to how much claims about what Bitcoin can do are either not true or they're just not necessarily better than what we can do in other ways, and then what we've been able to do in other ways. And part of the problem that we've wound up with such bad journalism, as we talked about, is sort of the lack of independent sources, especially academics like Neha, who's so valuable because she is independent. But it seems like one of the things that's really missing is the whole idea of the financial analyst. That, you know, Nathaniel, you were a business reporter, and these stock and bond analysts, that they're certainly not unconflicted, but that's the staple of financial reporting, is to go to the analysts. And does that infrastructure exist at all for digital currencies? And will it anytime soon? Because that would be a huge help to journalism. At least I would think so.
Yeah, I can answer that quickly, because I think that part of what we do at the Block is some sort of that. We try to separate our editorial house into the news team and the research team, and the research team is doing more of that kind of thing, where it's more in the vein of traditional financial analysis, but bringing in crypto aspects to this, which includes analyzing the network incentives and new kinds of questions to be asked about these protocols. But then we struggle with that also, because the best way to understand some of these things is to be, well, there's an argument that the best way to understand some of these things is to participate in them. And so then you are kind of maybe conflicted. And I think there are plenty of conflict of interest related questions to be wrestled with in this particular field that are different from traditional finance because of the nature of the thing, which is that you can mint your own coins, basically. It makes it very complicated. I don't know if Nathaniel or Neha have anything to add there.
Yeah, I mean, I think like when you were covering other industries, there tended to be experts. I mean, when I covered Wall Street, there were experts who understood this stuff. There were professors who'd been covering it for years. There were research analysts. I mean, they have their own conflicts of interest. And you're starting to have some of that here. I mean, I think the block has some really good analysts, and I actually would suggest that reporters, you know, even though the block is sort of a journalistic group, they also have researchers who are doing really interesting, you know, digging into the numbers, and that's been really valuable. I mean, you have firms like Chainalysis that do interesting work on this because they're coming at it, you know, looking for crime and helping governments with that. I mean, there are organizations like Masari. I mean, the thing is, a lot of the groups that are out there sort of doing the analysis are so bound up in the success of this and, you know, in their investments. And that's why it's really hard. I mean, I'd be interested to hear from Neha's perspective. I mean, it's always dangerous to kind of say like, here are the honest brokers, but I'd be interested to hear from both of you if you guys have feelings. I mean, you know, if we're talking to people who are thinking about doing journalism in this space or whatnot, like who are the most honest brokers? You know, who are the people who can help you understand, who understand it while not having those conflicts?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I want to push back against that idea of an honest broker, even though I was talking about how we've tried to stay neutral. You know, I need to fundraise to support my research organization. The higher the value of Bitcoin, the more people who are interested in Ethereum and whatnot in this whole space helps me do that. It makes my life easier. It makes my research more valuable. It makes, you know, my time more, you know, my expertise more valuable in the future. So even if I say I haven't launched a token, I certainly have a vested interest in this space and it's succeeding. And so I guess what I would say is, you know, just understand what people's interests are, rather than, you know, trying to avoid conflicts of interest entirely, get at what they really are and push back on how that might influence the way that they would answer your question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a constant struggle for me. It requires developing relationships and just sort of coming to a point where I understand where someone is coming from, and then not just having sources that will chat with me on background and help me with my bullshit detector. That's something that's taken some time to develop. But I want to switch gears again. There was someone mentioned in the chat that we haven't really talked about Ethereum much, and that's by design because we're trying to keep this as focused as possible and not confuse people. But I had planned to bring to sort of branch out at this point in the conversation anyway. And I'll take another step back and say that Ethereum is the second most popular cryptocurrency network after Bitcoin, and I think it's one of the oldest. There were several sort of Bitcoin clones that rolled out early after it emerged in 2011, 2012. But Ethereum was created by a Bitcoin enthusiast who wanted to develop a more general purpose platform. And he set out to kind of create what he called the world computer. And he built what has been called the smart contract platform, which I would describe as a network of computers that can be programmed to run computer programs the way that a computer runs computer programs. It's just a network doing it. So you can set up automatic functions to run based on prescribed inputs. And these are called smart contracts. And this has led to a whole new area, which is getting a lot of attention right now, called decentralized finance, or DeFi for short. And a lot of it is it's borrowing and lending and other financial services that don't require permission to do so. It's just sort of open access. As long as you have the hardware and the software and the wherewithal, you can start trading these tokens and making all kinds of sophisticated financial bets. And I think the question here was, there are a couple questions actually. One of them was, what about Ethereum? Can't you do different things with Ethereum that maybe are better than Bitcoin? But the other one was, is having these sort of permissionless, that's the term that's used, sort of unregulated to a large extent, financial networks, is that like a risk? Is that at all, is it sort of intellectually honest to think about those things in the same context as like an interconnected traditional financial system that was unregulated, that to some degree, and then came crashing down? I think where we are right now is trying to figure out the best questions to ask about this decentralized financial space, DeFi. And so I wonder, sort of starting with Nathaniel, what you think those questions are that we should be asking about DeFi and decentralized financial services.
I want to know what that kid has to think about that, because I feel like he would have as legitimate opinion as I would.
She wants to go to sleep soon, I think.
That's very legitimate opinion on this. God, I mean, I feel like I am more interested to hear what, I mean, I look, I think this new space, DeFi, requires the same kind of questions. I mean, I think a lot of the stuff right now that's being viewed as legitimate, you know, has some of the same questions, some of the same weaknesses. Some as the ICO boom in like the 2017, but there's a lot that feels much more real this time around. And so it's almost harder to kind of pull it out. I mean, the job in 2017 for a journalist was like, you know, like in a shooting gallery with like very slow moving animals. And now it's like, you know, these are much more like, I mean, these are well thought out. Like a lot of the big projects are relatively well thought out. It's hard to kind of figure out what their weaknesses are, but and to their credit, a lot of them are being used, like they're being used. So there's something real that's happening here that hasn't happened in the past. And I think that's really significant and worth looking at. And, you know, not just DeFi. I mean, I think a lot of other kind of decentralized networks here, some social networks. I mean, Neha wrote a really interesting paper about like why decentralized social networks would not work or hadn't worked at least. And I still don't know. I mean, actually, it's like a question I wanted to ask her, because there seem to be some that are getting some usage and like doing some interesting things. But you always like, I think a lot of the question with a lot of the new technologies is like, why do you need a blockchain to do this? Like, there are some basic questions you can just ask and like try to get a common sense answer. And if the answer is one you don't understand, then assume that you didn't get the answer. But it's, you know, why do you need a blockchain to do this? What does this do that the existing infrastructure out there doesn't do? Like, yes, I can borrow money on the Ethereum blockchain, but like, other than wanting to use Ethereum for collateral, why would I want to do this on a blockchain? Why is this better than the other way of borrowing money? And is there any indication that people are using it for that rather than just to like trade crypto? So there's something much more real happening now, but you know, it requires, I think, the same kind of skepticism.
Yeah, the problem here is I agree with everything that Nathaniel just said, and I'm worried that we're both kind of coming at it from from a bit of a skeptical, sort of critical perspective. And sometimes I sort of second guess myself and wonder, if I'm coming at it from such a skeptical, critical perspective, are there things that I just don't understand or I'm not seeing that are really there because I'm sort of, trying to find the problems in everything. Because the fact of the matter is just because something has a problem doesn't mean it's not going to work. So when it comes to things like DeFi, I mean, I think it's very interesting. It's leveled up from the ICO craze for sure. There's real stuff happening here. There's real insight, and but is it more than just speculation? I don't know. It's certainly the case that things like earning interest on your collateral and lending and trading with a good spread, those are useful things, but they're useful in the context of this cryptocurrency world that we've built up. And is it all a house of cards? Is it all built on toothpicks? That's the question. I don't know the answer to this question, but it's exciting and it's interesting. And I wouldn't bet against a lot of really smart people out there trying to figure it out. Even if I don't see exactly, even if I see some big problems in it, for example, I think a big problem with a lot of the stuff in DeFi is that either it is susceptible to black swan events or bugs or vulnerabilities that could cause people to lose a tremendous amount of money, or it's the contract is constructed in such a way that the developers can basically step in at any time and make changes or freeze funds or things like that. So what does that mean? That there's a tension between being able to, how risky the contract is and how susceptible it is to tail risk events, and whether or not it's truly decentralized. And what do people mean by that? A journalist, if you work in the space, you're going to hear a lot of talk about the word decentralized and why that's such a great thing and what does that really mean. And that's a complicated topic that I don't know we have enough time to go into today. I've tried to think about it and talk about it a little bit. I haven't written anything on the topic, but I gave a talk that's public on Andreessen Horowitz's website about a summit that they held around decentralization and some axes. But the fact of the matter is that it's entirely possible the reason these things are so valuable is because they're performing regulatory arbitrage. It's the case that there isn't, maybe they're not regulable in the same way that banks and brokers and whatnot are, and so they're able to do crazy things that the more traditional financially regulated institutions can't get away with. But that might be enough. I've heard stories in the past about companies, startups that basically ignored compliance for their first few years and until they got big enough that they'd captured enough user share and market share, and then they added the compliance in later, and that was a valuable strategy for them. So I'm very confused about this, and I'm not really sure where it could go. I could see it going either way, but I certainly agree that it's much more real. What's happening now is much more real than what happened in 2017 and 2018, and that means it's a lot harder to really get at what's happening and to try to find the holes, for sure.
Just to quickly, follow up on that. I mean, I understand why, from some perspectives, that could be presented as a good thing. This idea of arbitraging the regulatory system, but ultimately we're talking about assets that are worth something, at least for a while, and thus could be suddenly worth a lot less. And that's what the financial regulatory system is supposed to be for, at least to some extent, to protect investors who don't have full information. So isn't that kind of scary? That if one of the key justifications for Bitcoin is that it's unregulatable, at least in current form, that seems really disturbing to me. And I see that one of my students asked, is making the same point in the Q&A. Maybe each of you could take that on. Is that fundamentally what this is about? Just figuring out, a new instrument that the government can't control, but that also means that investors who don't have full information may lose their shirts.
The answer to that is yes. I mean, that is like this whole thing. I mean, there's a lot of new technology, but like at the end of the day, when you say like not controlled by a government, that what that means for most people is that governments can't control and regulate it and probably tax it. And like, by the way, they can regulate and tax it. Like government regulation has been central to the evolution of this space. Like if governments say banks, you can't deal with Bitcoin exchanges. Banks don't deal with Bitcoin exchanges, and Bitcoin isn't worth anything. For reasons that are kind of interesting to discuss, banks have decided to let that happen. Like they didn't for a while in China, and then China, like, kind of stopped being significant in this space. I mean, people could still get around that in some ways, but it was hard. And you really need kind of traditional financial institutions to be part of it for it to matter. And so, that means the regulation does matter, but it's the ways in which regulation doesn't matter that, I mean, crypto exchanges are largely just like legalized casinos. Like they're legalized online casinos where anybody can set up an account and do this. Obviously, to some degree, stock exchanges are as well. But the kind of up and down here and the gains possible are so much greater. That's not the only thing it's good for, but that is certainly a lot of why people are here. And yeah, like when you talk about decentralization, there are good arguments for why you want things to be decentralized technologically, but it does often come down to the fact that the central player that you are trying to circumvent is the government. Maybe you have good reason not to trust your government. Maybe that's like, maybe you should distrust your government and you should be allowed to go around your government, but let's all call a spade for a spade there.
Yeah, and to be clear, in the regular financial markets, people try to go around the government too. Okay, this isn't unique to the cryptocurrency space entirely, though it's certainly happening at a scale in the cryptocurrency space. It's interesting. So yeah, it's not just the case with the cryptocurrency space that people are sort of scheming to find ways to make money and get around government financial regulation. And what's been so interesting to me is that, yeah, governments have kind of been I don't know if it's different parts of them or regulators and enforcement or what it is, but there's this sense that they don't want to miss the boat, that there's some innovation happening here. They don't want to squash it. They don't want to fall behind. But then again, there's, the obvious sort of nature of a lot of these technologies is to get around central actors, which have traditionally been the place where government applies regulations and enforcement. So it's really been interesting to see this balance. And, now banks have, with the recent OCC sort of, what the OCC said, banks are, they've started to move towards more and more and more embracing and accepting this area, as opposed to preventing traditional finance from working with it. That's been the evolution.
Yeah, and I'm working on a story with a reporter at The Block about a community bank in Virginia putting crypto buying services right into its ATM on its on-site bank. And Bitcoin ATMs have been the whole scene has been kind of sketchy so far, but it's like all of a sudden some of these more risk-averse traditional financial institutions are letting this crypto stuff in, and I think it comes down to just the way we value things, and that's come up a bunch of different times in this conversation. How do we put a value on Bitcoin? It depends on who you are and where you're coming from. If you value it, then you're not as worried about the energy consumption. If you value the ability to circumvent the government, then you're going to think that Bitcoin is valuable. So I think it all kind of circles back to that. And I actually think that that's a decent place to stop, because we could go on and on about other topics, including the fact that central banks are starting to roll out digital currencies, which is its own conversation, but it's kind of separate from what we've been talking about so far. And so I just wanted to say that I really appreciate Neha and Nathaniel for joining us tonight, and having such an engaged conversation. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you all very much. Just a couple of quick announcements. I'll just say I learned a lot. I feel like the scales have fallen from my eyes. I'm a lot less idealistic about digital currency than I was 90 minutes ago, which is a good thing for a journalist. So this was very useful. So thank you very much to Neha and to Nathaniel and to Mike for organizing this. It was terrific. Everybody, you can watch this or tell your friends. It will be visible at journalism.nyu.edu/KC for Kavli conversations within a day or two. It'll be posted. And that is also the place to go for our next Kavli conversation on March 24th, which is about writing science-themed books for children. And we already have just a tremendous number of people signed up for that. And so I know that's going to be terrific also. So thank you very much, everybody. We very much appreciate it. And special thanks to Mike's baby daughter, who was very tolerant throughout this whole process and barely piped up at all.
Just there at the end.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.